There we go, live. Okay, so joined today by Chris Rogers, who is an English teacher and lead practitioner at a school in Crawley, Holy Trinity, and is someone who really encouraged me to go into teaching, and someone who I admire greatly, and is I'm constantly trying to get into the sort of Twitter and the blogging side of things, but has resisted, and he's very busy, so I respect that. He's going to talk to us today a little bit about something he does with his classes, which we've referred to as learning to learn, but I think we'll unpick that a little bit as we go through. So
Sure.
why don't you say what you mean by learning to learn?
Sure. For me, it's the idea that in education, it's not just about solely teaching subjects and content, but more about the process of learning actually itself. In my opinion, that's why we go to school. That's why we send our children to school. So it kind of helps answer that question you often get from students, maybe about Shakespeare or simultaneous equations of how am I going to actually use this in life. I'm sure subjects teachers can come up with loads and loads of answers to that question, but it's not often said to students, I think, that actually you're here to have the experience of learning, to understand what it is to learn, and humans will continue to learn for their whole lives, learn new things at different stages. So going through that education process and learning actually how to learn and developing those learning skills is as important as the actual subjects they're learning themselves. So that's what it really means to me, I think.
Okay, so from your point of view, that it's easy, not easy, but we can focus our attention on the content, we can focus our attention on the procedural knowledge and the declarative knowledge, but actually, if we're not getting down to something that they can take with them long term, something that is the overarching thing of the whole process, we're not potentially not really doing the job as well as we might have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's something to said that for that. I think it's kind of important to bring in metacognition at this point. How do you see it as different what you do with metacognition? And maybe that'll need you to kind of explain what you do in particular.
Um, well, I think it is very similar. In my mind, I consider learning to learn is almost like a subcategory of metacognition, whereby metacognition is the ability to think about thinking and have that sort of self-awareness, whereas learning to learn is particularly and specifically about having the ability to have that self-awareness about the actual learning process itself. So, one, how do humans learn? How do individuals learn in a more specific, subjective way as well? So it's about having that ability to understand the learning process, which I think is part of the bigger thing of which is the self-awareness and the ability to think about your own thinking. So
So
I
on a
think they're tied.
Yeah, so on a practical level, what does that look like in your room? Is that kind of I'm going to model how I'd pick apart this question, or is that to revise you'll need to do X, or what does it look like?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of what metacognition might look like in a classroom, a very simple way is just having the different skills on the on a screen or actually just in the classroom permanently, so analysis, evaluation, etc. And at the end of each lesson, ask the students to sort of gather around and let's go through which of these skills we've learned and actually used today. And that's kind of more of a metacognition. Whereas when it's learning to learn, when I'm introducing an activity, I might actually show the students or tell the students the thinking behind why I've chosen that activity and how they're going to learn the subject or the topic that we're learning through that activity. So when they go away, they're being independent, they're revising and so on, they can actually use a similar activity and they know the purpose, why it's used and why it's a good way for them to learn that particular topic or subject. So it's about the difference between sort of skills and thinking and also actual learning activities and the purpose behind them and why they're useful.
Okay, yeah, so I like that. I like that idea, and you would, for instance, stop a lesson and go, okay, so how am I going to make sure that you understand this, or what we're going to, you would explicitly say, now we're going to do X so that you can recall this at a later date.
Yeah, I mean, like we're going to do this activity because this activity will help develop your memory skills, or this activity will help you make connections between things. And this is something that we're doing today to make connections between characters in a novel and understanding how relationships link to this narrative. But you can also do something similar in a science lesson to understand the connections between elements, for example, and making those links. So just you don't have to spend a whole lesson on learning to learn, but just subtly or sometimes explicitly, just dropping it in as you go through the content and the subject is a good way of just filtering it through on a daily basis.
And would you kind of build in things like checklists about things that they should learn, or, you know, are there other strategies that you found really effective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is useful when you're looking at revision and you're asking students to revise, maybe as a homework in, for a mock, or whether it's actual big exams, GCSEs or A levels, to go through different things that they need to do, or different skills that they need to develop, or different ways in which they need to learn, can really help that. And it could be in the form of checklists, absolutely.
Yeah, because in particular in our subject, I feel like that's a question I get asked at least once a week. How do I revise? And I feel like I'm telling them, but perhaps there's a
Yeah.
disconnect there between the sort of the telling and actually, well, hold on, how are we going to actually utilize this? How, perhaps
Yeah.
what you're saying there is you're modeling that for them in lessons so that they can take that model away and rehearse that.
Yeah, essentially. And it's particularly in English because it's a skills subject. It's not just about memorizing the parts of the flower, as my history teacher used to say when kind of mocking science. It's not that sciences are, not as valued as history as he seemed to think. But certainly in a skills-based subject, I think actually it's a bit more nuanced in terms of how you revise. You're not just memorizing things. Obviously, in higher level science, you need to do more of that as well. But I particularly find question an awful lot. How do I actually revise for English? Or even, can you revise for English? Not even how can you revise. A lot of students actually question whether you can even revise for English. And I think that's because it's a skills-based subject and they feel like it's not as an easy amount of content to revise, other than learning maybe the plot and the characters of some of the texts you're doing. I think students get confused in terms of how to revise. So if you emphasize the skills and the learning to learn, I think that can really help overcome that barrier and that common question you get.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a rabbit hole there. You've said a few times it's a skill-based subject, and that could potentially lead us down a complete rabbit hole because I'm not
Mm.
100% with you on that one. But there's definitely two elements to it. There's certainly the procedural knowledge, and there's certainly declarative knowledge. And I think the declarative knowledge. I mean, we've just been this week really hotly debating what goes into our knowledge organizer.
Mm.
And there is obviously, I'm not saying for a second that you're saying there's no knowledge in English, but yeah, I'm
Mm.
drifting towards feeling that it's almost entirely knowledge based. Let's not drift down that rabbit hole. I'm going to stop. Because I know that is a total rabbit hole. So full range then, because as we're talking there about revision strategies,
Yeah.
I might want to be a bit more declarative, I suppose, in what I'm saying. Certain student didactic in kind of, you need to do X, Y, and Z because that's where you are in your journey. Whereas it sounds like this is a really good strategy, and I know this is something you know a fair bit about it, for our sort of H start point students.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, what my role at the school is that I'm overseeing how we handle and how we target and challenge our high achiever students. And I think it's a really obvious way to start because I think it promotes independent learning. And I think that's the real key to accelerating learning for the high end. And I think particularly universities and top employers do look for that element of independence. But I actually think it can be really valuable for students who are less able. I think that it's about, in a way, it's kind of about dignity, and it's about getting students who may not enjoy learning or who feel uncomfortable about learning, getting them to really think about their own learning and what it is to be learning a learner, and also to kind of develop that growth mindset as well. That actually, if you go through the process of learning to learn and understand how you learn, you actually might make more accelerated progress and have that extra self-awareness, which might make you start to make more progress and end up being higher. And I
So,
think it has worked. It's something that I was reluctant to do at first, but I think really talking to lower ability students about what learning is can
yeah,
actually be quite beneficial, yeah, and powerful.
and perhaps actually to some extent, the thing I'm talking about there, as though it's students at the as though students at that bottom and those low starting points need something particularly spelt out for them. Perhaps that's a limiting factor overall. It might have a short-term benefit, but actually what you're saying is that there might be a long-term benefit that's worth that small risk initially. And it's actually, it's not that big a risk actually, just to say, here's why we're doing this, here's how it might influence your revision.
Yeah.
And when I visited Michaela maybe this time last year, actually, I visited Michaela School in London. I think it was the head there, or maybe the head of English, said to me, what we believe basically that what works for the two extremes will work for everybody. So, you know, you kind of touch on that sort of point there.
Yeah, and it can work in slightly different ways, but it's certainly I found that it's worked at both ends of the ability spectrum. Yeah, and I found it can actually be quite motivational, and I think that's often the barrier with low ability students, that they don't really see the benefit of learning because they may have had quite a few failures, or they may have this understanding that actually they're weaker than other students, and that can be quite demoralizing. So to start to think about how can they improve and how can they develop their own learning, and what learning actually means, I think that can be really powerful.
Yeah, and you're talking about not what they can do by the end of this half term, but what they can do today, tomorrow, next week, next year. And actually that's a powerful tool to give them, isn't it? You know, that
it's about playing the long game to an extent.
All ends, and we need to do that. I think education suffered greatly when we've focused on this controlled assessment or this piece of coursework, or we've got this to finish by the end of. So what's the research behind what you're doing? It sounds like a lot of the research that's referred to as metacognition, and you're using a slightly different tool for it because you've got a specific purpose. What's the research behind it, as far as you know, your sort of strategy?
I mean, that is a starting point. For me, it was the process of doing something which is called TEAP, which you can look into in more depth, but that has an emphasis on a learning cycle and different stages of learning, and how each stage is really important in anyone's learning, and it offers the ability for you to expose those stages of learning with the students, and it's all underpinned with research. In terms of, well, I think all teachers are researchers on a very small scale, and I've certainly personally seen accelerated learning in terms of my own students and the ones that I've tried this with. In terms of Hattie's visible learning, students' disposition to learning is actually one of the highest factors. So I think, obviously that's quite broad, but I think it comes into that. So I think there is some research, and obviously a lot of the research comes from, as you say, the philosophy of metacognition, which has been widely written about.
Yeah, and actually you're kind of hitting on how I think we probably most usefully use research, which is we compare it to our own anecdotal experience and what we see working in our lessons, and then it comes down to us as professionals. I mean, there's a danger with research and any sort of pushing education or any sector. There's a danger that actually we remove the professional element of it, and professional is about being a judge of what is effective, isn't it? So it would be slightly remiss. You said there a little bit about the idea that I've lost that thought. That I should have shut up and thought.
It sounded like that was going to be a really tough question. So
it was something that you'd said that I was kind of learning, accelerated learning. There's a conflict here, and it would be remiss of me not to sort of ask you about this.
Sure.
You're talking in one moment about the long journey, and then you're talking about accelerated learning. I think we probably all know from experience that when we try to accelerate the learning, we often sort of find that the long-term gains are lost. What's been your experience with that? And could you tease that sort of conflict there that seems to exist?
Well, I suppose it depends to a certain extent what you mean by accelerated learning. What I mean by accelerated learning is kind of the opposite, or something that's distinctly different from accelerated teaching. And I think what you touched upon earlier was this worry that if we have a focus on learning to learn, that we might waste time doing that. And I think there's a real concern, particularly with most recent curriculum changes in terms of the amount of content that needs to get through. And I think what you're worrying about accelerated learning is that you're thinking maybe it's more like accelerated teaching, the idea that we've got to rush through this work, we've got to rush through this topic, we've got to cover X, Y, and Z before the exam. But accelerated learning isn't about rushing things. It is about playing the long game to an extent, but it's equipping students with the knowledge and the ability to learn to be independent, to understand the processes of the human brain and the psychology of the human brain and how we learn. So it does speed up their own learning, but it also, you can still play that long-term game of it having that impact, in 2-3 years and so on. So I think you need to have an understanding of this distinction between accelerated teaching, because teaching isn't the same as learning.
No.
Just because you've taught something doesn't mean anyone's learned it, and I think that's really important to consider. I don't know if that's answered your question really
No, it
well,
has,
but...
because actually, you've said here that what you're talking about isn't what in the past people have meant. I mean, we end up in a sort of Wittgenstein style argument, don't you? Not we, but in general, because you end up with this thing whereby one person says the phrase accelerated learning and they mean X. Person B says accelerated learning and they mean Y. And you end up with a sort of, this is where my Wittgenstein knowledge falls down, Vienna circle sort of situation where someone thinks they've interpreted it and I'm using that and da 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 da. But actually they're doing something totally different, which was away from, I mean, Dylan William could talk about that all day, couldn't he? AFL and what that transformed into. So, yeah, I wanted to tease out the idea here that you're saying this phrase accelerated learning, but what you're actually talking about is that they can continue to make good, solid progress across time, and that with the extra content, actually, this is a support and not a cost. The one sort of danger that strikes me is that if your idea was going to be misinterpreted, it would be misinterpreted to the kind of independent learner and the sort of Vygotskian, let's just draw it out of the brains. We've taught them how to learn. Here's the material. I am the facilitator again. And we ended up, I think when I first qualified, I remember there was a sort of dark days of independent learning, of group tasks, and it's your fault if group tasks aren't working. Flabby sort of lessons. How is this different to that, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get to.
Well, I don't think having really structured lessons with quite a lot of input from teachers is mutually exclusive to independent learning and learning to learn. And I can't remember, is it Paul Guinness who said the expression "the devil is in the detail" in terms of how you set up an independent learning lesson? And I think some of the worst lessons I've taught is when I've had a group of students who are high ability and I've just made the assumption that I just set them a group task or some kind of very long task over a few lessons that they're actually going to be able to do it. And I think you need to have an element of scaffolding involved. And also, I think actually sometimes the more you group or divide up a lesson in terms of the learning cycle, the more structured it is. But then you can look at the different stages of learning and expose that with students. So the first is the initial grab, like preparing ourselves in order to learn something that is high challenge but low stress to get them involved. Obviously, the explicit sharing of outcomes as well, giving students new information in different ways and talking about why a video might be really good, or listening to something of your auditory ways of giving new information, because all learning needs to have some kind of information that you're dealing with, and then having another structured part of the lesson where you're exploring that information. It might be quite structured in terms of the activity to do, but you're saying the purpose of this activity is to get your head around this new information, to explore this new information, to take risks, to make mistakes. And then the next stage, the activity we're going to do, this is actually you demonstrating what you've learned, and this is an application of your knowledge. It could be a test, it could even be something like a presentation and so on. But the purpose of this is, in any cycle of learning, you need to be able to demonstrate what you've learned, and then you have a reviewing stage, which is a bit like the plenary. So that's very structured. And that involves a heavy amount of learning to learn and learning as well. So it doesn't have to be these sort of very flabby, as you say, lessons which are unstructured. So I think the devil's in the detail, and I think you do need to allow freedom for independence, but it has to be scaffolded and it can be very structured as well. So I think that's the answer, really.
Yeah, and I think those lessons in of the dark days of kind of, I remember on my PGC being told that the kids had learnt too much, just
Yeah,
but they hadn't had time to go off and do some group work around what the new knowledge that they had. They hadn't learnt the knowledge. I
yeah,
knew they hadn't learnt what I taught them
yeah,
explicitly. And I think you're right that just because there are bad ways of doing something, it doesn't mean that all ways of doing that thing are bad. And actually, the structured element there was, I think, in the past, an assumption that particularly, I mean, for God's sake, people called them G&T students, like they were able to
yeah,
go out for a cocktail. Just
yeah.
there was a sort of idea that, well, these kids are bright, so they can do this, so off they go and do that, and that's where you mark
Sure.
your other kids or something. There was a lot of that
Yeah.
kind of thing going on, and just even this morning, I was supposed to move some boxes from there to there, and I got a song that I'm learning on guitar in my head, so I stopped
Mm.
doing that and started doing that, and that's so easy. I'd imagine that I'd probably be in and around the higher ability start point, I'd hope, when I was at school. And even I, in a menial task that was very easy to complete, got completely distracted by something else I wanted to do. So
Yeah.
yeah, you're not sort of proposing that this is a great way to leave the kids to the lesson themselves. This is an add-on that can be purposeful for long-term games.
Yeah, and it fits in with the idea of having some, an element of control and structure to lessons as well. It can be done, absolutely.
Could you talk about a little bit about sort of, maybe it's the first time actually that this was really successful, where you realised this had mileage, or a time recently perhaps when it was really successful? What was the sort of problem that you were
Yeah,
overcoming?
I mentioned this earlier. It's been particularly useful when students have gone away and they've used a learning activity or process in the lesson in their own or study. And they've come and spoken to me and said, "Oh yeah, that thing that we did in class, which is helping with our memory skills, or that activity we did, which was helping make connections, rather than just reading the textbook and making notes, which is what I normally do. I actually basically have a revision lesson where I actually thought about the different stages of the cycle, and I actually, a bit like before I did my revision, I actually planned myself a lesson. I basically taught myself using the same similar strategies that you use in the lesson, um, and sat down for an hour and did that. So they basically did a lesson plan before they actually did an hour's revision, using some of the techniques that we use. Now, that was a higher ability student, as I'm sure you've guessed, but that was a particularly successful example of it. And that was really quite a big thing to hear for me. That was just, that for me was the essence of independence. That student was completely aware of how they learn and the techniques and activities that really helped them in lessons, and they were able to apply that on their own. And I would just think that they could use that in any learning. If, you just mentioned playing guitar, that if that child wanted to learn to play the guitar, that maybe they could have used some of the techniques that they've learnt in order to learn English, in order to learn to play the guitar.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, when I picked up the guitar at 18, 19, the way I learned was by thinking how I'd become okay at football and stuff like
Yeah,
that. I went, right, well, I'll need to work out what the patterns are, and then I'll need to repeat those patterns a
yeah.
lot.
If you've learnt
Um,
one thing and you've understood how you've learnt it, then you can apply those skills to learning something new, and hopefully those skills will last you for the rest of your life.
so it's Saturday now. Monday morning, someone's going to watch this. They're going to take away 5 things and they're going to implement 5 things in their lesson. What are they going to be? Maybe they don't do them all in the same lesson. Maybe they do across the 5 or the
Sure.
6 or the 3. But what are
Yeah.
they going to do?
Okay, so number one is that you've trained to be a teacher. You spent a lot of time reading about what makes learners learn or what helps learners learn, and you're an expert, and you're a professional. So why not just occasionally expose some of that with your students? Why not just tell them what your thinking was behind the lesson plan as you're teaching? We're going to do this activity. I've planned this for you because, and just explain that and what it is you want to get out of them and what the purpose of the task is for. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, don't always assume that if you're giving students the ability to be independent or learning to learn or developing metacognition, that you don't have any input and that you don't have to structure lessons at all. Don't be afraid of developing these characteristics of being with students and understanding the process of learning is getting in the way of you teaching the curriculum, because I think if you do the groundwork, then actually I think you will find that you can get through the content quicker and they'll understand the content more quickly and have that accelerated learning, so it will pay off. And again, it doesn't mean that you spend a whole unit of work doing learn to learn and then you start your actual subject. You can filter it in as you go. Is that the fourth? I'm
I think
just trying to think of a
you're on
fifth.
3 or 4, I don't know.
Let me have a think. Yeah, next one is don't assume that it's only suitable for high ability students. It's something that is worth experimenting with lower ability students, and I think you'll be surprised by how engaged they get when they actually start to think about learning is and how they can improve their learning. And lastly, really tie in with this whole idea of the growth mindset, and that we are constantly developing. Our brains are like muscles, and if we learn how to use them and learn how they work, then I think you're going to end up learning more. Your students are going to learn more, and I think it could be really positive. I think that's 5.
I think that is 5. And thank you very much, Chris. I love kind of hearing you speak, particularly about English education, because you often speak from a sort of principle point. You kind of have an maybe egalitarian sort of view on what is. It's not simply what works. You think about what would be fairest overall, and what you seem to think about. You seem to think about what is the right thing to do, not just what is the most effective. You try to look for something that is both. Would you say that's fair? Is that kind of
Yeah, I think so. And I think every 4 years we will have a different government that comes up with a different idea for education. And I think what we've all got to understand is that we are professionals and we've gone into this job for a reason, and that we need to think what our purpose is in education. Yeah, and have, be quite forthright with that. Absolutely.
I mean, one thing that I'm going to do based on this is I'm certainly going to model my thinking around questions. I think I don't do that enough. I'm looking at that word. That seems to be a bit of a key word there. Actually, let me just circle that, because that seems to be underpinning the whole question. They've said that's an interesting statement. I'm thinking about that sort of non-fiction writing section across all the papers. Actually, there's often ways of unpicking the statements that we as experts naturally do that students don't. Those students that don't sit around the table and they're across class and across ability ranges, they're across social class and ability range, and they don't sit down and argue with their parents about whether there's a god, or whether we should have a festival in town, or whatever the discussion is. There are students in our classrooms who aren't practiced in picking apart someone else's statement and using it as part of their point or in their discussion. So that's something I'm going to personally do on Monday. But I like this idea of just saying, I know I've asked you this question before, but we're doing this because learning happens over time, and sharing that knowledge that I have. I think I'm gonna do that Monday morning.
Yeah, and think about when you start a lesson, think about sharing with the students what they're going to learn today, how they're going to learn to do it, and why they're going to do it. And that's my favorite way of doing learning outcomes. I think that really, from the start of the lesson, that has that learning to learn. This is what we're learning. That's the content, that's the topic, that's the skill. This is how we're going to learn it. That's the bit that I'm trying to add in. That's the whole purpose of this conversation. And also the why is important as well. And it could be, yes, this is going to come up in the exam, but also this is going to be really useful for you to later in life for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, a bit of retrieval practice for me. The what, the how, the why. Is that it?
Yeah, what you're learning, how you're learning it, and why you're learning
I like that. That's a really
the how is really important. And I think people forget the how. They forget to teach the students how they're learning.
Yeah, that's a really great thread to underpin what we've just discussed. So I think we'll call it a day there. That's a little under 30 minutes.
All right,
for a little longer than we planned, but inevitable, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think anyone at any point in their career, I'm 7, 6, 5. I don't know. I'm a few years into this now. 6, I think. Yeah.
I reckon with 6 or 7. Yeah.
6, and I've taken something from that. I know that the trainee that I had last year would certainly take something from that. She was at a very high point at her journey. And I think someone 30 years in might go, oh God, I did that in 94. I should do that again. You know,
Yeah,
there's something for everyone there. So thank you very much for sharing.
no worries.
All right.
And thank you.
All right. Right. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Speak to you soon. Bye bye.